Hey, Nomi, what's going on? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? Oh, no. No, that's not what I said. I didn't say anything about people from Boston. I said that that people from Massachusetts speak the worst expression of English, in the globe. It's comparative. It's comparative. Comparative. But yeah, okay.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Boston, Massachusetts, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic communications entity. On today's show, Monday, August the 9th, Ellie Meohagan, Yorgos Venizelos, Ninon Lagarde, Vincent Bevins, Henry Williams and David Ox of the Gravel Institute, Keegan Goudiss and his robot Arun, and featuring committee's deputy director, our own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now a man who is very sorry if and only if you were offended, Arun Chaudhary.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. And yes, as Jacopo says, anyone who was offended by what I said about people from Massachusetts last time should please feel free to help themselves to the buffet of apology that we are offering. It's for you. We want this for you. Nomi had some harsh words about it, apparently.
Yeah, the committee program will be serving apologies from 8 to 11.
That's funny. That's good. That's good. We can use that. Let's re-record this and put that in, but I'll say it. I'll say the joke so that I'm being the funny one, because Jacopo, I don't want people to feel like you're not being sincere about the apology. I think I can do that balance of kind of the joke and the apology at the same time. I'm not sure that that's something, English is second language, etc. I'm not sure that's a burden that we want to put on you necessarily. But anyway, besides being sorry, we have a great show lined up. We have Vincent Bevins is going to be talking about Jakarta method. That's going to be amazing. And actually, speaking of things that are incredible but not amazing, is if we've seen these wildfires that have been creeping up in Greece outside Athens. And I think oftentimes, the world is full of thousands of fires, certainly hundreds and hundreds more than there normally would be. This one is different because it's on the outskirts of a major world capital. So we thought we'd bring in Yorgos, if you remember, from our panel on Greek politics, to tell us a bit what's going on. So we're going to do one of those 60-second explainers, and then we're going to go right to Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk. So Jacopo, can you put 60 seconds up on the board?
Absolutely. 60 seconds on the board.
Okay. Thank you. Good to see you, Yorgos, and let's do a countdown.
3, 2, 1, vai.
Greece is going through massive fires over the last few days, and there's a number of interconnected factors at play here. First of all, state corruption over the past decades has resulted in inadequate planning and zoning, which makes it difficult for rescue teams and firefighters to access fire points and save people. At the same time, it makes it difficult for people to escape. Another issue is a controversial law that exists in Greece and makes it possible for investment and development in areas affected by fire. This policy exploits forests and natural areas, and essentially it encourages arson, as developers know that they can get their hands more easily and more cheaply on land. Additionally, austerity and cuts in public sector services over the past decade has stripped off not only welfare state but also civil protection services, including the fire services. This leaves the fire services underfunded, and for this reason we have seen more policemen on the ground fighting fires in the last few days than firefighters. Of course, we cannot isolate the phenomenon of fires from climate change. Temperature across the globe is rising every year. Heat waves are becoming more and more common, and in fact Greece has been going through a week-long heat wave, and as we know, heat waves help the dry out of land, which helps spark and spread fire. And this is a phenomenon we have seen not only in hot countries but also in Siberia and Canada as well.
Like I've said before, it doesn't totally come naturally to me. You know, the cynical thing I always say about politics is that everyone is more racist than you think they are, and no one actually votes on the environment. But the things we're seeing are so horrific and so ever-present and so obvious that it behooves even those of us who don't know if this communications effort will lead to anything, if the species is going to do anything. We've got to keep talking about it, keep talking about it, keep talking about it. Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and this is our segment, Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk. With us, we have some familiar faces. Ellie Mayo-Hagan of Class Think Tank, the show's own Deputy Director, Julia Doubleday, of course, and then Ninon Lagarde, who's joining us again from France, who is the Communications Director of the Popular Primary, and who I'm hoping, Ninon, you can give us a little update on how the French elections, which as we know are happening next year, are going, and how the Popular Primary, this really interesting project that tries to combine the center-left and left into one proper party ahead of the election so that it's not just Le Pen and Macron, how you all are doing. Can you give us a little insight on that?
Yeah, thank you. So it's summer holiday. So basically politics stopped 2 days ago and nothing's happened right now. But the election are in 1 year and things are starting to move. And the couple of things that happened for the past 2 weeks is that the mobilization against the COVID situation and how it's dealt in France is making a rise of multiple leaders of the far right, which is sad, and the mobilization is getting huge, but it's dividing the voice of Marine Le Pen. So it's a bit of something that we could see during the next presidential election, a numerous amount of candidates which are sharing the voice of Marine Le Pen that may become proper candidate for the presidential election, which is sad but a good thing for us if we want to win in 2022. So here is for the news on the left side, on the right side, on the left side, I'm still working for the Popular Primary, for the Primary Popular, which is a project that we are trying to have only one candidate for the French presidential election in order to have a chance to win again Macron or Le Pen against them. And things are going great. We started the sponsorship a month ago, which means that there is thousands of people all around France who are saying maybe to this primary. Christiane Taubira should participate, Mélenchon should participate. Everybody can say, hey, I want all those people who are sharing the same value to compete during the primary election in order to maybe become the next candidate of the progressive camp in France. So it's summer, so in summer in France things are super slow in politics, but maybe the month of September will be crucial for us in order to have a better overlook of what's going to happen for the presidential election.
And the summer is slow, but one primary is ongoing right now, which is the ecologists, the Greens, right? Can you discuss at all how that is unfolding and your organizations, the conversations you've had with them now that they're actually doing politics and not just anticipating it?
Yeah, the Green Party is having its own primary election in September, October, and it's a primary which they are trying to make to be as huge as possible in order for them to have a huge base of people who are choosing some candidates. There are 5 of them, so it's for now, not a lot of people knows about this primary election, and I don't think it will have thousands of voters, especially because the way to vote is a bit difficult and the medias are not talking about it a lot. But at the end of the day, we hope that the winner of this primary election for the Green political party, and we hope that the winner will join the primary election that we are hosting, in order for us not having a candidate of the Green, a candidate of the Socialist Party, and a candidate of the far left, because we can't have all of those if we want to have a chance to win. So we are very much in contact with all of the candidates and hoping that the one we will win will be the one that we have good relationship with right now, and hopefully it will be the case. But I'm not super aware of how many people already said they're going to vote and how wide this primary will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, a lot of us are really looking at what you are doing very specifically with a lot of interest, because there are so many places in which, a kind of too big to fail center-left party plus the civic left does add up to an electoral majority, but that electoral majority just never seems to coalesce. Ellie, moving over to the UK, I would love to hear from you. Just, we've heard some squawkings from your Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, about several different things, charmer that he is. I think probably one of the most irksome, I saw you tweeting angrily about it, was his sort of trying to take credit on behalf of Margaret Thatcher for environmental stewardship, certainly before it was popular or profitable. How is that playing in the UK? I mean, to us in the US, this seems probably just sort of like the kind of praising of Reagan on any given issue, whether it's AIDS or something that he was really bad on. It's just sort of the veneration of the party elders.
Well, what you've got to understand about the British press is that if a figurehead from the right makes a point, it doesn't matter how asinine it is, the radios and TV stations will be filled with people saying, but is it? Maybe. What an interesting thing to say. Mm-hmm. And so we've been treated to this ridiculous spectacle today where people are debating whether Margaret Thatcher is in fact an eco-warrior because she closed loads of coal mines. I mean, it's so embarrassing that it's not even worth talking about. But I think what is worth talking about is the fact that Johnson has, throughout his career, has used this sort of particularly stupid quality of the British press to completely distract from, the bad things that he does. So every time he gets into trouble, he just acts like a bit of a clown or says something a little bit provocative, and then that becomes the story. There was a really famous incident last year, I think, where he'd done something bad. I can't even remember what it was because who's counting? And there was lots of paparazzi outside his house, and so he went out and gave them all a cup of tea, and then became the story.
This clip is intense. Take
the
tea. He's so insistent. He just sits there with it until they take it.
Yeah. So the subject of that caused him to say these comments. So what he said was, Britain has a really good head start with climate change because Margaret Thatcher closed the coal mines, which is you've got former mining communities in the US, that those mines were not closed for the sake of the climate. It's absolute nonsense. But the reason that he said that was because he was asked details about the government's industrial plan when it comes to transitioning away from fossil fuels. And actually, the government doesn't have an industrial plan. It did, but it deliberately scrapped it 2 months ago. But, I'm sure it's the case in lots of countries over the world, tackling the climate crisis has probably been the most horrible, devastating political failure of my lifetime. I just can't believe how it feels like all of the pieces are in place. We're ready to do this, we're ready to go, we're ready to change the world, except for politicians who just can't do it, who just are paralyzed or just absolutely refusing to do anything because of a tiny amount of people that they want to sort of keep in power. And I think what Boris Johnson shows over and over again is that the media in the UK is not equipped to hold him to account. Either they don't want to, which I think is kind of plausible, or they just don't know how to. And they have failed massively as well during his tenure to actually treat him seriously.
I mean, would you say this is also playing into something you were actually just mentioning when we were off camera about how Boris Johnson was with someone who had COVID and he doesn't want to get tested or quarantine now? Will the press also, for the same reason, just give him a pass on that? While for another member of the public, or certainly if Keir Starmer tried to pull something like this, I can only imagine the coverage that would happen.
I don't think so, because I think he probably won't. Well, we'll see, but not sure that he'll get away with that, because the one thing the British press is quite good at is hypocrisy. They love tearing down hypocrites. So a few weeks ago, the week when I was on holiday, so that week 18th of July, that week, he came into contact with Sajid Javid, our health secretary, who got COVID, because of course he did. And,
because of course he did, yeah.
Yeah, and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister both said, well, we won't self-isolate because we're part of a government programme. But then everybody was like, well, what government programme? And how have you enrolled in this? And why wasn't I told about this? And then they sort of went, oh, no, we've changed our minds, we will self-isolate. So they've already tried to pull that off once. And so the fact that he's trying it again now, I think he'll probably just lie. I think he'll lie and say I wasn't in contact with the person, which already people are saying isn't true. But I'm not so sure that he'll get away with that. And I think as well, there is this real sense of something about COVID really sticks into British people as sort of one rule for them, another rule for us. There's something about, there's a lot of judgment about people that don't follow the rules. There's something about breaking the COVID rules that seems to be particularly not okay in the eyes of the British public. So I'm not sure that he'll get away with that one.
Right, finally did Dominic Cummings in, right?
Yeah, but in the long term, it won't damage him, because the media, they treat every little thing that he does, they treat it like its own independent circus, and then they move on, rather than a pattern of behavior that really indicates a leader that doesn't care about anyone or anything except his own advancement, So, hey, it's great that we're ruled by him. I love that.
Good for you.
And we learned last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, with John Butler, how actually even pointing out that the Prime Minister is a liar on the floor of Commons is actually not acceptable. You can't say someone is drunk or lying, right? These are the two rules.
Yeah, well, that is how we
Politeness
maintain...
is going to kill us all.
Yeah, that's how we maintain, the power structures of the UK, is through politeness and niceness and making certain things unacceptable to say, no matter how true they are. And, calling a liar is one of them.
Well, in the no malarkey age of American politics that Joe Biden has ushered in, we certainly this week, Julia, I think you'd agree, have a sort of a mixed bag. Can you help sort of translate, especially for our European friends, sort of what's happening? And I would say the three things that I'm thinking about in terms of the good news is that maybe moratorium on evictions pushed by Cori Bush and other members of the squad out on the Capitol. Some maybe not so great news is that this bipartisan bill is sort of a paltry, the $1 trillion is a paltry amount compared to what's needed for American infrastructure, let alone what's needed to invest in things. And it also feels like in some ways the Biden kind of push is starting to meet the resistance that will end up shutting it down. And, we saw Nancy Pelosi sort of speaking towards it being impossible to do student loans, sort of a lot of kind of this isn't possible here-ism. Where do you think we're at in terms of the forward thrust of the Biden agenda and just sort of balancing these small wins, larger losses, just help, I think, especially folks across the pond, understand where it's at?
I mean, I think the big takeaway from this week is just that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the Justice Democrats, are actually flexing some muscle in a way that, their supporters have been wanting them to do. And they have been doing it over the past couple weeks in a way that's super compelling and has gotten good coverage. I actually, I'm a big defender of the Justice Democrats. I think that they have always pushed the envelope when they can, and that they're strategic about the battles that they pick. And in this case, I think that they were also able to do it in a way that was sort of undeniable. Like it was very front and center. So what happened was essentially, Congress went on vacation. Biden claimed that he had no authority to extend the eviction moratorium, which has been keeping 11 million people in their homes or something like that. Yeah. And Cori Bush, along with some other members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, were really camped out at the Capitol steps for days to sort of protest this. And ultimately, I think it became such an embarrassment that the Biden administration did move on it. So it turns out he does have the authority, or may have the authority to extend it. They found the authority, to extend the moratorium. Which was a big win, I think, for progressives. AOC and Bernie were also down there. They were speaking with just people who came out to join the protest directly, which I think is great. That being said, we also had this big loss this week. Nina Turner not winning in Ohio 11.
That was the one I forgot. Yeah,
which is super disappointing. I don't think it's really that surprising because all of these elections are uphill battles. I think her getting in would have been a major coup for progressives because she is such a firebrand and she is so vocal.
Utterly fearless.
Yeah, so her loss was definitely rough. At the same time, I think we have to look at is a special election. It was a random day, and I think the thing we continually run up against as progressives is that in order to get into power, we have to win primaries and we have to win special elections and we have to win the elections that are really only participated in by committed Democrats, and committed Democrats don't tend to be the people that want to reform the party. So it's this sort of catch-22 of, in order to even get on the ballot for general elections, we need to either turn out people who don't typically vote, which is a massive challenge that no one is really doing well, or we have to convert people who think that the Democratic Party is great and they love the Democratic Party, which is also extremely challenging. So it's always an uphill battle. Nina had a lot of name recognition, though, in this district. I think that I'm sure there are things that could have been done differently. I certainly felt like her ads were kind of weak, but I don't feel like
we talked about this. They seem sort of typical in a way that she's not. So why? She's
well, I think Nina is such a compelling person and such a big personality that it's hard to make her seem sort of dull in an ad, but the ads kind of did that, at least the ones that I saw. I'm not going to be hypercritical of everything that the staff did because I don't think I know enough about what happened on the ground, and there's always what do they call it, Monday morning quarterbacking. I don't really watch sports, so that might not be the expression, but I think that's what they call it.
We're not sure which day we should be quarterbacking.
I don't know what day it is, and I don't know what happens in football, but it's the thing where you say you could have done it better. Yeah. But that being said, obviously we got to do better to win these seats that we need to win. And to what Ellie was talking about earlier, I think the climate crisis is terrifying at this point. I saw an article this morning about, they project these things and they say they're going to happen in 100 years or 50 years. And then the next year they're like, actually, it's happening now. This has happened so many times that I don't know why people don't spot this pattern. But, they were talking about the currents in the Atlantic, eventually slowing down. And now there was this new research today that's like, oh, well, it's, it's happening right now. It's already happening. So, it's terrifying, and there is not the political will to do something about it, although the public is very, very, very ready to do drastic things about it, as Ellie said.
Yeah, actually, Ninon, can I ask you, in France, is climate an issue that the Greens are able to really run on, or is there sort of consensus across the whole center left, at least in what people say, that the issue becomes much more diluted amongst all the different parties on the left and center left?
Well, the Green had all the political space on ecology and climate change before 2027, but Mélenchon started a really green campaign and showed us that he was convinced and he wanted to change things and fight against climate change, and he was convincing. So now people think that it's not only the Green Party who is really into ecology. For the Socialist Party, what we've seen concretely from the people who are elected show us that they are not super convinced, even though they talk about it. So no, more and more the Green Party isn't the only one who is talking about ecology, for sure.
And Ellie, in the UK, does Labour only talk about climate in terms of, job opportunity, Green New Deal, or are they embracing it more as an emergency? I mean, it's just been an incredible summer, as Julia says, to sort of, look at pictures of things on fire, look at pictures of, water on fire, cities on fire. Like, it seems like a hot time.
Labour has only just started putting forward policies on anything, So the answer would be, until relatively recently, they didn't really talk about it at all. But now they are talking about it as an opportunity to, remake the economy. They've promised around 500,000 green jobs. So I guess, that's how they're talking about it. I don't think it has quite the kind of breadth and depth, their climate policies that they had when Rebecca Long-Bailey was the sort of shadow industry business etc. Secretary. That was really like a comprehensive sort of transformative plan. But like, I'm really glad that they're doing something, even if it isn't exactly what I would want. I'm really glad that they are drawing a good, clear line between themselves and the Conservatives on the issue.
I mean, probably the biggest victim, Julia, just come back to the U.S. to finish up, is a lot of the climate change funding and the things that were supposed to be really sort of transformative. Do you think that sort of the political failure on these budgets is going to kind of limit the ability of the Democrats to even talk about climate in the midterms? Or do you think that kind of just the general crisis will be something that they push? Or neither?
Neither. I think so. What I was saying earlier about the progressive wing of the party flexing its muscles, I think that also carries over, and I was going to talk about this, but I forgot, also carries over into this infrastructure fight that's happening. So essentially, for people not in the U.S., what has happened is that there was supposed to be this massive multi-trillion-dollar, I think like $4 trillion infrastructure bill that has now been
There's the
down.
$9 trillion, that's the Cadillac plan. There's the $4 trillion that people say is okay, and we have $1 trillion on the table now. Yeah.
But that's not the whole story. So there's a bipartisan bill that could be passed through the House and the Senate. It's a $1 trillion bill. It's not enough. The climate measures were removed. But Congress, the House, is holding up that bill because they say that they're not going to pass it until this other plan, the budget reconciliation bill, which contains additional funding and a bunch of the stuff they cut out of the original infrastructure bill, until that passes. So they're basically holding the $1 trillion hostage to get the other bill passed. And AOC and the other progressives have basically said, we're not doing it. We have enough of like a quorum that it's not going to pass without us. So that's what they need to be doing. I think that is what they're doing at this point. Even Nancy Pelosi now, also in this case, I agree with what she's doing. She's also flexing her muscles and refusing to pass the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. So the problem with this, of course, is that when you're holding things hostage, on the other side, you have to have people who actually give a shit about anything. And with Republicans, it's just hard to say whether they care if nothing ever gets done again. Right. Like, for them, the status
Shoot the
quo.
Hostage. Go ahead. Like, what do we care? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, I don't think that's a problem with the Democratic Party. I think that's a problem with the entire system, and it's a problem with the Republican Party, and it's a problem with big money in politics. But the reality is, if you have a bunch of people on the Hill that are only representing wealthy donors and special interest groups and corporate actors, why would they care if nothing ever gets passed? Like, they like the status quo. So it's very hard to negotiate with people who don't want anything other than to stop you from doing what you want. So yeah, I don't know where that's going to lead. I will say as of now, it's basically just gridlock, but I do appreciate the efforts that are being made by the progressive wing of the party. I think that it's really clear that they're at the very least forcing the Democrats into uncomfortable positions and then forcing the Democrats to sort of make decisions about where they want to stand in these sort of like public battles that are playing out. And as the strength of the progressive wing is growing, that's becoming more and more obvious. You have Chuck Schumer, I think, as we've talked about before on the show, has certainly moved to the left. And, we saw him congratulating Cori Bush after the eviction moratorium was extended and saying, you did this, and looking very excited about it. I think it really is. There are a lot of people in power where they go where the power is. So the more power you have, the less likely they are to mock you or work against you. It's just the way it is there.
And just how these crucial votes are these extra votes that were picked up in 2020 even, not in the original squad, right? It's like Mondaire Jones and Jamal Brown. And these are... Jamal Bowman, oh my God, yeah. These are these really crucial... Just, one vote here, one vote there, it matters. And so everyone, when you're calling and when people are like, this district that you don't care about, we want to get a Justice Dem in there. This is why it's actually like big things happen because of the way our legislation system works. Julia, thank you so much for coming on. As always, Ellie, thank you so much. Ninon, really nice to have you back. And we'll see you all soon.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, corul. Committee, we young way, submittee, we committee.
So look, I know that you can't babysit me or whatever through this experience. So is there anything that I should know that's coming up in the Global News Rodeo that I need to do correctly?
Number one, wahrscheinlich.
Again?
Working in German.
Wahrscheinlich.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably.
Ja.
Ja.
Das ist gut.
Und Nummer zwei ist Gemate.
Nummer zwei ist
Gemate.
Was? Ja. Gemate.
Guatemalan
Gemate.
president.
The Guatemalan president. Yeah, I got this. I got this. Hi, and welcome to Your Global News Rodeo, a roundup of events happening all over the world as curated by the show's own Forrest, Lovette. Let's go. Item 1. SPD wahrscheinlich. Center-left gains in Germany. Deutsche Welle is reporting that the Social Democrats are gaining ground in the German polls. A big reason for the surge is Olaf Scholz, the current German finance minister and chancellor candidate for the SPD. Scholz is extremely popular and is benefiting from popular gaffes made by current frontrunner Armin Laschet of the CDU and Green Party candidate Annalena Baerbock, who I won't even say what her last gaffe was. It was not a good one. Defying all odds after disappointing results in 2017, the SPD is closing the gap between themselves and Merkel's party. Scholz may be looking to lead a government with a new coalition of the SPD, Greens, and Free Democrats, the FTB. Cooperation between the three parties is already a moniker called the Traffic Light Coalition due to the respective party colors. I mean, this is a best case scenario in I think a pretty wishful way. Let's see what happens. It is nice to see the SPD start to gain back some of what they've lost, though. It's tricky. Item 2, get the fuck out. Guatemalans revolt. The Socialist Worker reports Guatemalans took to the streets this past week to call for President Alejandro Guillamotéri's resignation. Thousands of people marched against unemployment and austerity measures. Last November, demonstrators set fire to the Congress building in Guatemala City. The protests gained fervor when the Attorney General fired the head of Special Prosecutor's Office Against Impunity, which is investigating corruption committed by Guillamoteri. One demonstrator was quoted as saying, "We do not recognize him as president because he no longer represents the interests of our country." Item 3, no Zumba for Zuma. Imprisoned ex-president hospitalized. Al Jazeera is reporting that former South African President Jacob Zuma has been hospitalized. Zuma, who is 79, was jailed last month for contempt of court in a corruption trial and has said of the trial that it is politically motivated and a witch hunt by his opponents. The South African military service said it was a routine observation, but the ex-leader also traveled to Cuba last year to receive undisclosed medical treatment. If the former president returns to jail, he faces a separate trial for snubbing a commission probe, which will have to continue hearings. Despite this, Zuma's legal team has repeatedly turned down invitations to testify. Item 4, Mediterranean Matchbook. Wildfires rage in Greece and Turkey. CBS News reports thousands fleeing Greece and Turkey as unbearable heat waves and wildfires ravage the areas of both countries. Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis spoke of the situation in a televised address, saying wildfires are the reality of climate change. Some describe the scene as apocalyptic, as temperatures have reached 113 degrees Fahrenheit in the worst heat wave in 30 years. More than 1,000 firefighters have been dispatched to the southern regions of Greece to combat the blaze. In Turkey, as many as 36,000 people have been evacuated in the Mulga province when the fires threatened a power plant. On top of the devastation, the fires have also disrupted COVID-19 vaccinations in Greece, dealing another major setback to the country. Item 5, Remembrance and Ratification. Hiroshima remembers. Until agency reports, the mayor of Hiroshima called on his country, Japan, to immediately sign and ratify the UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Mayor Matsui spoke to the crowd gathered at the 76th anniversary of the bombing at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. He also called for a trust-building dialogue and later said, nuclear weapons are the ultimate human violence. If civil society decides to live without them, the door to a nuclear-free world will open wide. Japanese Prime Minister Suga was also in attendance and was quoted after the event saying Japan will serve as a bridge between countries with varying opinions on how to proceed with nuclear disarmament. I did both pronounce it Hiroshima and Hiroshima in that, but I did only say nuclear and I never said nuclear.
Oh, that looked painful. Is that the most physical exertion you've done today?
No, I had to move the table in here. Are you kidding me? That was
Second
it took like 3 hours. Yeah. Hi, and welcome back to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and today we have a very special Deep Cuts in which we have Vincent Bevins, who's going to talk a lot about the thing we talk about a lot here, which is U.S. interventionism and what we can learn about it and apply it to the present day. Julia Doubleday has put this together. As always, we are deeply grateful. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we'll be talking about?
Definitely. So Vincent Bevins joining us today. As you mentioned, he is an award-winning journalist, and he's the author of this book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program That Shaped Our World. This was a very well-received book. It's super engaging. It contains a ton of information that I personally didn't know. And it really spans this multi-decade period of time, both events in Indonesia and across the world, from the years leading up to Sukarno's time as president, to his overthrow, to the ensuing chaos and violence, and the long-lasting ramifications of that. It's estimated during the U.S.-supported pogrom against communists and leftists in 1965 and 66, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed, although we may never know the true number. In the process, the world's third largest communist party was exterminated from existence. So we want to delve into, what happened in Indonesia. But first, I think we should talk a little bit, setting the scene, what was going on in those decades leading up to this extermination of leftists. So before we get to the coup, let's talk about Indonesia in the 40s and the 50s. How did Sukarno rise to power, and what was his sort of political persuasion?
Yeah, especially like aligned with and not aligned in the Cold War, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to start. I usually try to start this story in 1945, and I usually think it's a good way to explain the world in 1945 is to go back to this whole division of First World, Second World, and Third World. Now, the term Third World has been degraded a bit in the English language by the racists that have spoken it over the last 70 years. But initially, the Third World was quite a optimistic and forward-looking project. This was about recreating the world after the end of colonization in the global south. So in the First World, we had the rich countries of the formerly imperialist North Atlantic plus Japan and Australia. And it should be stressed again, all of these countries engaged in colonialism or imperialism as they became rich. Then you had the Second World, which was led from Moscow, especially after the end of World War II, a very powerful force, but not nearly as powerful as the United States in the First World. I think that's also important to stress. And then you had the vast majority of humanity. You had about 2/3 of the people on the planet. These are people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, almost all of which had lived through centuries of European or North American colonialism. And in this period after 1945, this mass of humanity was going through the process of either recovering from colonization or still in the process of trying to kick out the Europeans. I mean, famously, France came back to Vietnam to try to reestablish rule there, failed. In Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country on the planet by population, the Dutch, which had controlled this group of islands for a very long time, came back after World War II and tried to reestablish colonial domination, and they failed. Now, the first person to take over Indonesia in 1945, after the re-expulsion of the Dutch, was a man named Sukarno. And he was really at the forefront of this Third World movement, which was about allying the peoples of the Global South, what we now call the Global South, the peoples of the Third World, to reshape the rules of the global economy. And they believed, I think quite understandably, that now that formal colonization was over, now that formal European control of Asia and Africa and Latin America was over, they would naturally and obviously have the ability to take their rightful place alongside the First and Second World. And they would really be the third act of history, not sort of the third-rate countries. So Sukarno was left-leaning, not a communist, but certainly influenced by Marxism, as almost everyone that was important in the anti-colonial struggle had been in the first half of the 20th century. Yeah. And he was putting together, he was the president in a very young and fledgling democracy that attempted to be not aligned with the Soviet Union, but opposed to capitalism in its most savage forms, opposed to colonialism, and really all about uniting the third world in the attempt to reform the rules of the global economy. So that's where we are as Indonesia is born, under the leadership of this left-leaning, Muslim, anti-colonial sort of founding father. He really gave the ideology of Indonesian-ness to this archipelago nation, which had really only been held together up to that point by Dutch imperialism.
So let's fast forward a little bit to this. In 1955, there's the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, where the leaders of the third world came together, and eventually, you know, the meetings that they had there sort of grew into what we call the non-aligned movement. So maybe just like delve a little bit more into what was going on at this conference. Was Sukarno, I mean, it seems like he was really a leader of the third world, so-called third world. What happened in the years after that to sort of cement these alliances that were coming up in the era after colonization was ending?
Yeah, exactly. So Bandung 1955 is really the moment when the third world comes into its own as a real self-conscious, concrete project. It happens in Indonesia on the island of Bandung. Sukarno gives the famous opening speech, and many of the Indonesians and people throughout the rest of the third world that I met for this book told me that once they heard Sukarno's opening speech at the Bandung conference, they never forgot it for the rest of their lives. It was sort of seared into their brains. Mm-hmm. And he took the stage and he said, this is the first meeting of the world's so-called colored peoples in the history of mankind, the first time that the black and brown peoples of the world had come together without white people overseeing them. I think that was probably a correct analysis of what was going on. And so the very disparate types of governments and movements that existed across Africa and Asia, and Brazil was an observer at the 1955 conference, so Latin America as well, didn't agree on everything, but they all really agreed on the sort of guiding philosophy that he put forward at Bandung, which was anti-colonialism and the quest for true sovereignty above all other things, right? He says everybody here knows, you know, the embarrassments, the depravity, the indignities of colonialism. This is what's going to unite us, and this is how we're going to come together to reshape the world. And this really spawned a number of organizations that were active across the global south. You know, in the book I talk about, you know, magazines that shared stories of what it's like to be a feminist Muslim in Egypt versus in Indonesia, stories of anti-colonial arms struggles told by people that had already won their struggles, attempts to create a new kind of global journalism, sort of like from the South, by the South, you know, being written by the peoples of the third world rather than by people like me in the English language press from the North Atlantic. And 1955 was also the moment at which the United States decided they could no longer tolerate Sukarno's vision. In the first years of the Cold War, the United States really didn't know what they were supposed to be doing in the global south. I mean, the United States was new to this position as the overpowering, the far and away most powerful country in the world, as the hegemon, as we might call it, or as an empire, depending on what your political ideology is yourself. And they knew what to do with the second world, but they didn't know exactly what to do with the third world. So initially, Sukarno was seen as sort of tolerable because he wasn't a communist, and the communists had experienced a crackdown during the uprising against the Dutch. In 1955, for two reasons, the CIA really decides, no, this guy and this vision of Indonesian-ness, this vision of the third world, is not something we can put up with. One is the Bandung Conference, which was met with racist condescension in the State Department. And two was the fact that the unarmed, moderate Communist Party was doing better and better in elections. And this was something that really worried MI6 and CIA because, as they recognized in now declassified files, the reason they were doing better and better was because they were simply good at politics. People liked them. They weren't tricking anyone. They were really sort of organically gaining popularity. And so in the years after 1955, you see not only the flowering of sort of South-South projects, third worldism as a sort of guiding ideology, but numerous attempts coming from Washington and the North Atlantic to crush this vision of a post-war order.
And I know we're going to get into some of the actual horrible mechanics, and then they will be horrible. But a question that I have here is, in terms of sort of the narrative war, is this where you see the U.S., Western Europe folks start to talk about nationalism in a different way, in a sort of more threatening and less self-determination kind of way? Or since this isn't a hardcore Soviet thing, like how does this kind of fit into the narrative of what the U.S. is supposed to be doing, let alone the hardcore political power tactics that we'll see?
So if we're talking about the mainstream narrative about what's going on in the global South, like what you could have read in the New York Times and papers like that, it was really just like a misrepresentation, if any representation was going on at all. This conversation wasn't really being had in the living rooms of the American people. Now, behind the scenes at CIA State Department in the White House, things really changed in 1953 with the ascendance of Eisenhower. So the CIA, which had been formed just after World War II, they had been failing repeatedly in the 40s and early 50s at actually making any dents in the Second World, at going after the actual communist nations. Now, Eisenhower, someone who did not like actual war, who deplored the cost of the Korean War, appoints the Dulles brothers. And under the Dulles brothers, you have the first successes of this CIA method in Iran, 1953, in Guatemala, 1954. So after the ascension of the Dulles brothers, in the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, you really have a flip as to the way that, to answer your question, nationalism is viewed in the global South. Under Truman, in the early years of the Cold War, it was viewed as something perhaps that could be tolerated. Maybe, okay, I kind of get what they're doing. They want to be independent, kind of like we did. After 1953, absolutely not. After 1953, if you were neutral, you were an enemy. Okay. If you were standing up for national sovereignty in any way that was slightly different from the way that the United States wanted to impose it on you, you were as bad as communists and needed to be crushed. So with Iran, Guatemala, 1954, the CIA really proves to Eisenhower, I've discovered the cheat codes for crushing sort of left-leaning independence movements in the global South. We could just do this everywhere. And lo and behold, they turned to Indonesia in the middle of the 50s to crush probably the most famous, if not the most famous, the most eloquent proponent of this type of sovereignty, of this type of post-colonial independence.
Yeah, I think you hit on something interesting too with the term nationalism. It's so broad and it can be used in so many different ways that it has this ambiguity that can be really sort of weaponized against people. And I think I've seen similar things with like the term populism. So this idea of like, well, Donald Trump is a populist and Bernie Sanders is a populist, so they're both populists. So that means they're the same, and right. It's like these are very, very broad terms that can refer to totally different situations. And then it allows sort of bad faith actors to draw these parallels where maybe, there shouldn't really be a parallel there.
Yeah, smart people in like the people that actually cared about the nuances of life in the global South in the State Department brought up that exact point at the time, because people that came out of World War II, the men running the United States government, they thought nationalism, they thought Hitler. Oh, right. Like national, right, exactly. That must be racist thing.
That's exactly right.
Whereas Howard Jones, one of the ambassadors to Indonesia, which I focus on quite a bit in the book, he's constantly trying to tell people in Washington, he's like, no. When Sukarno talks about nationalism, he's talking about the construction of a nation out of imperial slavery, right? Like the nation for him is not a racial thing at all. It's actually this idea of nationalism is constructed through the anti-colonial struggle. It's an entirely different thing. It has more to do with Benjamin Franklin than anybody in Germany or Italy in the 30s. But no one, I don't know if they didn't listen to him as much as they didn't care. He was paying too much to the boring details on the ground, whereas their job was to smash and clear a way for the budding U.S. hegemony that we, I think, all live in now.
Yeah, and I think my use of the term like bad faith, I do think that when it comes to these issues, it's the people that are utilizing the terms in a lot of cases do understand that you could make a distinction there. But it's just easier to make their argument if they can make it very digestible for the public. So just telling people nationalism is bad is very, I think, an easy pill for people to swallow. So let's delve a little bit more into the U.S. as we sort of get up into the 60s. What was going on with the sort of formation of the CIA? Who were the major players in the CIA and in Indonesia as we get closer to the coup? And also, what happened after Kennedy was assassinated? How did the U.S. policy toward Indonesia change at that time?
Yeah, there's a sort of there's a weird back and forth from 1955 to 1965, which I'll try to summarize really quickly. After Bandung, and after it becomes clear that the Communist Party is doing better and better elections, they try to crush the Indonesian left. First attempt is just to funnel money into a conservative Muslim party, Masumi. This is a classic strategy that works very well in Italy. This is always like it's what you try first. It's low cost. It's easy. No one's gonna get caught. This does not work. Masumi does not do very well. The Indonesian Communist Party keeps doing better and better. Now, in 1958, you have the CIA copying what had been done in Guatemala. And so, I mean, you ask who's really in charge in the CIA. The CIA officially, initially, is supposed to be supplying information to the president, which seems fine. That makes a lot of sense. But from the very beginning, they had a covert operations team, and the man that was sort of the godfather of this and the leader of it for a long time was a man named Frank Wisner that I talk about quite a bit in the book. I met his son during the reporting, and he had been quite influential in making all of these coups happen. And so Guatemala 54, which was a success, throwing over Jacopo Arbenz and crushing Indonesia or Guatemala's young democracy, becomes the model for a invasion of Indonesia in 1958. So the CIA foments and then participates in a civil war in 1958, seeking to break a country apart. Now, this consists of actual Americans flying over sort of idyllic islands in Indonesia and dropping bombs on them and killing civilians. And this is something that, the gap between what everybody knew was happening on the ground and what the press in the US would have been saying, or what even the diplomats had to pretend that they thought was happening is really huge. So the Indonesian left has been saying throughout all the 50s, look, the US is an imperialist power. They're taking over for the Europeans. Look what they're doing in Vietnam. They can't be trusted. They want to crush us. They will never allow this kind of sovereignty to really take root in the global south. And when one of these CIA pilots crash lands into the island of Ambon and is caught after a bombing campaign, they are proved right. So the side of Indonesian politics that has been saying for a long time, hey, the Americans are trying to destroy us, it seems that they have been vindicated by 1958. So after this, the United States has to really back off. This is a big embarrassment. No one in the US really finds out about it. But in Southeast Asia, this is a really big deal. Interestingly, John F. Kennedy was one of the few people in the post-McCarthyist political environment in the United States that kind of understood that distinction that we just discussed. He was one of the few people that had traveled around the world, talked to leaders in India and Southeast Asia and Africa, and understood what anti-colonial nationalism actually meant in the global south. And he said many times in the 50s in public speeches, hey, and we need to be aware that they're kind of fighting for what we fought for a long time ago. We cannot just treat them as if they're all just communists. So when he was elected in 1960 and takes over in 61, Sukarno was very excited. Sukarno thinks he has somebody that understands his whole project. So in the first years of the 60s, there is this uneasy peace where even though Sukarno's gotten closer to socialist countries in Asia and a little bit closer to the Soviet Union, there is still technically officially friendship, and the US, like the Soviet Union, is providing aid. Now, all of that changes when JFK is assassinated. I think this is one of the more underappreciated consequences of the death of JFK. The stance of the United States towards Indonesia changes entirely with the ascendance of LBJ to power, and I think that the massacre would not have happened in the way it did, at the time it did, at least in 1965, if it were not for the death of John F. Kennedy.
So I know you were just mentioning the CIA's intervention that was going on for a period of years, and that the left, the PKI in Indonesia for a lot of years. There was a free press in Indonesia at that time. There were leftist journalistic outlets who were reporting that the CIA was interfering, but they were basically sort of treated as conspiracy theorists. The New York Times was started to run op-eds denouncing Sukarno and basically, claiming that they're telling wild stories. I did want to focus on one of the CIA plots against Sukarno just because I think it's sort of, I think, become sort of an urban legend because it was so ridiculous. Right. But this is the plot to get rid of him through a fake pornographic video.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Oh, yeah. Classic.
Yeah, so I think something to understand about the CIA, especially in the 50s, is these were quite literally frat boys with unlimited resources and no chance of being held accountable for anything. Destroying nations, wasting money, coming up with stupid ideas. They could do whatever they wanted. And in the late 50s, we don't know the exact dates on either the film or the assassination plot, but some of the things that they came up with were to either kill Sukarno, and it came out officially in 1975 with the church commissions that they had discussed assassinating him. And then it also emerged through sort of testimony and rumors, but I think it's quite clear that it happened, that they actually did record a sex tape using an actor in Los Angeles. The producer of this sex tape was Bing Crosby and his brother Larry, because again, we forget, like those of us that grew up like in the era of the X-Files or later, the idea that the CIA does bad stuff is very natural to us. But back in the 50s, if the CIA came to you, you just did whatever they asked, right? It was considered whether you're the New York Times, whether you're Bing Crosby, whoever, it was considered patriotic to help the CIA as if you were helping sort of, fight the Nazis or something. It was only later that we understood that they did these insane things all the time. And according to testimonies about the film, they hired a Mexican-American actor in Los Angeles, made it look like he had slept with a Russian KGB agent, and they were going to release this in Indonesia and, one, destroy his reputation as like a good Muslim, they thought, and two, release this plot, which is oddly reminiscent of a lot of the stuff that happened during Russiagate, that he was actually compromised by the KGB. He had slept with the KGB, they controlled him. What they didn't know is that everybody in Indonesia already knew that he slept around all the time, and news that he had slept with a blonde Russian woman would have been unsurprising, if not a source of pride. But also apparently the film just wasn't very good, so they ended up not releasing it. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, but it's not, right? Like, because they were really like, this person genuinely inspired feelings of national pride and hope in building a better future together as a young nation, people working together for the first time in centuries to create a world with their own hands. And they wanted to just destroy his reputation because it might have made things easier geopolitically in that part of the world. So it was not released, but it was, one of the many insane things that the CIA did in the late 50s and early 60s. Until after the Bay of Pigs, it seems they recede a little bit. I mean, JFK is, despite his sort of quasi-third worldist rhetoric in the late 50s, his administration is certainly not shy about interventions, coups, fomenting and destabilization in the global south. But in Indonesia, at least, there was officially kind of good relations until he died. Now, when LBJ takes over, that changes. He seems not to care as much about Indonesia. He doesn't really understand what's going on out there. He's under a lot of pressure domestically. And sort of the hawks around him in Washington that have long argued that this Sukarno guy has to go, kind of rise to positions of prominence in the U.S. government.
Right. Okay. So let's move on then to 65. Leading up to 65, you have the coup in Brazil happens. Sukarno famously says in a speech, the U.S. can go to hell with your aid, which makes a lot of headlines. Then after the Gulf of Tonkin, Sukarno establishes relations with Ho Chi Minh's government, which is a big no-no to the U.S. So let's talk about what happens. What was the September 30th movement? What sort of launches the coup? And then how does Suharto take power and consolidate power? Yeah,
so as you sort of briefly summarize, in 63, 64, you have this escalation of tensions between the U.S. in Indonesia, which is really started by Johnson's decision to cut off aid. And Sukarno sees what they're saying about him back in the U.S. and he's like, "Screw you! Like I'm the leader of a country. Like I get to do. I don't treat me as if I'm a servant to you." And at the end, and then so the ambassador that I described earlier as being sort of a little bit more careful and understanding of things in Indonesia than other people in the U.S. government, he's removed. And they bring in somebody that is widely seen to be sort of a ringer, a bruiser, a coup specialist. He had helped carry out a coup in South Korea previously. Everybody thought that this guy's is coming here to help carry out regime change. Now, we now know through declassified files that we don't know the full scope of the activities that in this period, from 64 to the summer of 1965, CIA and MI6 are agitating behind the scenes with the goal of creating a clash between the very well-armed military, which has been receiving U.S. funding and training since 1958, and the very popular but unarmed Indonesian Communist Party. The Indonesian Communist Party, we know now that the CIA and MI6 knew at the time, would have won elections if they were held fairly. But CIA and MI6 knew exactly what happens when an unarmed and an armed group clash. They hoped to create a confrontation in which the left would be crushed. Now, the September 30th movement is a still shadowy and mysterious mechanism through which this clash did take place. We are not exactly sure to this day who exactly planned it, to what extent they wanted things to go this way, hoped things would go another way. All of this is very hazy, and I interviewed a lot of people for the book, people who lived through this, people who were first-hand participants in some of the events, and everybody has a different theory as to exactly who planned this and why. But I think the important thing to say is that this confrontation was created. And immediately, this confrontation was used as a pretext by a general named Suharto, who was relatively unknown to most Indonesians, but he was known to the CIA, at least somehow, to seize power and begin a remarkably well-crafted propaganda campaign in the country, shutting down all communications mechanisms that the army did not control, and using the ones that he did control to spread this sort of Hollywood-esque story of feminist, Marxist, witchcraft terror carried out literally against the genitals of upstanding Indonesian officers. It's like you could not create a more perfect story to sort of scare a man in a sort of patriarchal society, or really any society. So immediately he spreads a story that actually was the communists that had been trying to take over the country, that they had a plan to kill everyone, and that the Indonesian women's movement, which was probably the largest feminist movement in the world at the time, had actually taken some generals into a dark lair, castrated them in a tantric communist ritual of demonic violence. And again, this is funny, but to this day, the women that were in this real organization, something that was really about sort of making sure women got educated, opposing genital mutilation, all the kinds of things that almost every sort of liberal or even conservative in the United States defends now, to this day, these people are still smeared in 2021 as witches or as anti-man or as anti-human. So Suharto spreads this story with the active assistance of the U.S. government, the British governments, and media in both of those countries. And he uses that story, again, once more, as a pretext to round up between 1 and 2 million people, arrest them. These are often members of the Indonesian Communist Party, people that were affiliated with one of its many, many organizations, or people that were simply accused of being one of these organizations. About 1 million of these people stayed in concentration camps that were for people to be held purely for their political views. And another 500,000 or 1 million of them were taken out in the middle of the night and stabbed or thrown into rivers or strangled. And the reason it was so easy to kill this many people was that almost nobody that went into prison thought that this could ever happen to them. The Indonesian Communist Party was not a Che Guevara-style group of rebels in the hills that knew that they were sort of fighting against the order their country. I mean, like, the PKI was aligned rhetorically in many ways very, very closely with Sukarno. If you were like a good student, you might have joined the PKI because that was, a good way to sort of like do a bunch of like history classes. If you were into literature or the arts, you often were in a PKI affiliated organization. It wasn't the kind of
people destined for the civil service.
Yeah, it wasn't people. It was people that were working at the post office, not people that wanted to blow up the post office.
Yeah,
please,
go ahead.
Please.
I was just going to say, I'm really glad that you're talking about that, because I was going to ask, specifically, it was super striking to me in the book that some of the folks that you interviewed, they willingly basically went to the police, down to the police station because they were asked to. And their feeling was, we live in this democratic society now. We've been, freely exercising our right to speak in the press. They weren't an underground organization. They were a really massive organization that operated freely within this democratic context. So, I think it really is crucial for leftists in particular to understand the way these things unfold and to understand it's actually really common in all of these circumstances we've seen across the world for people to say, well, that can't happen here. And that it does, so I think that was super, super compelling, super striking, super scary that so many people just couldn't imagine that their own government could turn on them and murder them, essentially.
Yeah, and in this book, we're going through the main event, which is 1965, but in the book, I try in some way to touch on the 20 plus cases of this type of thing happening in the Cold War. And all these people I met throughout the world, this is a theme that always came up, right? Mm-hmm. Like, whether it was 1973 in Chile, whether it's 1965 in Indonesia, whether it's 1954 in Guatemala, before this stuff happened, they would tell me, I would have thought this kind of stuff doesn't happen anymore, right? So, like, in the case of Chile, this is really common. They're like, oh, no, this is the 70s. This isn't Guatemala. That kind of stuff is over. Like, that kind of stuff doesn't happen here. And then, lo and behold, it happens there. And as I said before, this is sort of why it was so easy. It's very, very hard to kill 500,000 to 1 million people. And while it's been a few years now since I finished the research for the book, like, talking about this part is always hard, because I would go through Sakon, who I'm thinking of, who I'm still in contact with. He's like doing really well. His daughter just got married. He told me about how he had gone through the school system in Central Java. The mayor of his city was in the Communist Party. Like, all of his teachers were in the Communist Party. He just really liked politics and history and stuff. And he told me that when he went into prison, he was kind of like, oh, it was fun. Like, oh yeah, there's kind of like going to be, it's like a football match. It's kind of like, oh, the left is getting sort of, a slap on the wrist for something or other, but I'll explain to them that I didn't do anything bad and it'll be fine. And then in the middle of the night, a bunch of his friends disappear and they never come back. And this is the dynamic which really makes possible the mass murder and makes possible the ascension of Suharto. I think this is another important thing to stress, is that this mass murder was not something that happened incidentally to Suharto's dictatorship. A lot of times in the English-speaking world, we talk about the Cold War. We're like, oh yeah, well, we backed a lot of bad guys that did bad things. Suharto killing all these people was not something that he kind of did in his spare time. If not for the destruction of the Indonesian Communist Party, the social base of President Sukarno, the largest unarmed party in the world, perhaps in history, perhaps the largest democratic socialist movement in human history, he would not have taken power. And if not for the U.S. cajoling him to take power, he wouldn't have done it this way. This was really history was taking a step forward through this mass murder. It wasn't just something that happened and it wasn't important. This really changed everything. And it was because people never thought that this could be possible.
Right. Yeah, and I want to also talk about the U.S. In those early days in October leading up to the beginning of this extermination campaign. What were they thinking? What were they saying? And then how did they contribute to this mass killing?
Yeah, so now, we have I mean, we still don't have full CIA declassification for the period, although in the book I called them up and asked, hey, can you tell me what you were doing?
Never hurts to ask.
And yeah, I mean, as a journalist, you always ask for comment. They unsurprisingly didn't tell me, but we have a really good sense of what the State Department was doing and saying, in large part thanks to a great historian, Bradley Simpson, whose book Economists with Guns really made my work and a lot of other work possible. So briefly, as soon as Suharto seizes power illegally, the United States recognizes him as the leader of the country rather than Sukarno. They supply communications materials to him. They discuss supplying weapons to him, although it's not clear whether or not there was ever needed that they do so because he already had so much U.S. Supplies. The U.S. with the help of this communications equipment, Suharto spread this propaganda story that I told you about, and then throughout all of the communications between the United States and Suharto over the period of the mass murder. And in my book, I picked some select cables that you could just read exactly what they were saying. The U.S. was getting in-depth reports of all the people that were being murdered, how they were being murdered. And as this was happening, was making it very clear to Suharto that you will be recognized, you will get aid, you will be able to take over as leader of this country if Sukarno is deposed in this way. And Suharto understood that killing more of these people was going to lead to being recognized by the so-called free world. There's one cable that's really interesting. It says, at one point they just turned around and asked straight up to the Americans, how much are these dead bodies worth to you? How much will we get for this? And the answer is quite a lot. And then, for me, that is damning enough. But then later, one employee of the State Department gave an interview to the Washington Post and said that he was supplying names of communists or whoever to the Indonesian military so that they could be killed, crossed off, and passed back to them. So sort of, make sure you get this guy, make sure you get these guys, make sure you get these guys. So while no one in the U.S. was pulling the trigger or sort of, plunging the metal into the flesh of these innocent leftists, they were a part and parcel of the operation at every stage, going back, I think, a full decade. I think you cannot understand what happens without understanding 1955 to 1965, not just 1965 itself. And then everything that the Indonesian military hoped would happen if they killed all these people happened. Suharto became one of the most important allies of the West in the Cold War, basically got carte blanche to do whatever he wanted in his own country and in his region. So as a result, he became one of the most corrupt leaders in human history. He ended up invading East Timor, once again using anti-communism as his justification for what he wanted to do in the first place, killing perhaps a third of that country with the backing of the U.S. and Australia. And until the end of the Cold War, this was somebody that was really a fully card-carrying member of the free world, of the West, of the global fight against communism.
Right. Unsurprisingly, there obviously were major economic incentives for replacing Sukarno. I know that, one of the common threads that we see over and over again is that as the global South looks to nationalize their resources, take back their resources, that always tends to be something that triggers a response from the West. In the book you mentioned that the U.S. basically said to Suharto, we'll work with you, exterminate the PKI, get rid of Sukarno, and also this plan to nationalize oil, we don't like that. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the economic situation changed and what the so-called Berkeley Mafia was.
Yeah, the oil one is really interesting. Bradley Simpson, the historian I just mentioned, uses it as an important counterfactual. Because sometimes the State Department would say, what could we do? We don't control these people. But when it mattered, first of all, I think that's ridiculous that the entire terrain upon which they construct the counterfactual doesn't exist because they were encouraging them to carry out the killing. But in this one case, when it became clear to the West that Suharto might continue with this plan to retain national control over the country's oil industry, they immediately and very effectively made him change his mind. The full pressure of the U.S. state was brought to bear upon Suharto. It was made very clear to him, if you do this, the deal is entirely off. So throughout the history of the Cold War, there's often this kind of this dilemma, this dialogue, or sort of this contradiction, where on the one hand people say, well, are all these atrocities motivated by ideology? Is it about anti-communism? Is it about sort of the U.S. disdain or fear of the Soviet Union, or is it really just about like economic power? Is it about material interests in the global South? And like, I think that is an unnecessary contradiction, right? Like it's both, right? It's almost always both. Sometimes the proportions, are much larger on this side rather than on this side. But if you really want the CIA to come for you, the right thing to do is to set out a geopolitical path, which is independent of Washington, and also to threaten the profits of an important U.S. company which has the ears of the foreign policy establishment of the United States. In the case of Indonesia, I would probably say it was a little bit more geopolitics than oil, but oil mattered a lot. And oil was the oil industry is famously good at making itself heard in Washington, D.C. And here they really put influence on the U.S. government and on the budding Suharto regime to make sure that they had access to those resources. Later, mining gold became very important too.
Yeah.
But this is another case where it was really both.
Yeah, I think those two things can layer on top of each other as well, where it's, there are certain people who are losing out financially, but they know it's not a compelling argument to say, hey, I don't want to lose money, so we should depose this person. So they have to have some sort of philosophical argument, for why this person needs to go. And then there are all of these true believers that sort of buy into that line of thinking, like, oh, okay, I see the reasoning here. So I think you're right on the mark that it's just this sort of swirl of there are these economic reasons that things happen, and then there are people who pile on to whatever propagandist story is in the media and sort of swallow it whole. And I think we've seen that, certainly in the U.S. over the last few years, not to get too far off topic, but if you look at, something like Bolivia, where we something like Bolivia, where we had this this coup that essentially was probably for lithium. The way the press talked about it was, oh, well, there were irregularities in the election. That's a super easy go-to line. People will just repeat that back to you. You don't need any evidence to back it up. You can just say that. But let's get into then, I think we got to wrap up here, but the last few questions, let's just talk about the ramifications of what happened, this horrible extermination, all around the world. In the book, you do a great job of, sort of tracing that thread across many different countries, many different places and times.
Yeah, so while we have largely forgotten about this event in the English-speaking world, in 1965, this was something that everybody noticed. This was a big deal. I mean, this was the largest communist party outside of China and the Soviet Union. This was one of the founders and loudest proponents of the Third World Movement. This reverberated throughout planet Earth and especially the global South. So in two very different ways. On the one hand, for other left-wing movements around the world, especially ones that had believed in the unarmed, peaceful, democratic path to socialism, a lot of them looked over this and thought, oh, that's not possible. Actually, the imperialists will come for us and we could all end up in a river. So a lot of leftist groups in the middle of the 60s had this debate as to whether or not we should radicalize, whether or not we should arm, whether or not we should take to the hills. And I point out a few cases of where that did happen. In other cases, they chose not to be influenced. But this really changed the left's understanding of geopolitics. And I think it's really hard to understand places like Cuba in 2021 without understanding this logic from the perspective of the left in the global South in the 20th century. They thought that if you didn't become self-defensive, you were going to all be killed. You and everybody you knew was going to end up dead. Now, on the right, the world's anti-communists, the world's the allies of the United States, potential allies of the United States, the radical far right looked at 1965 and thought, okay, we could do that. That worked. They got away with it. it was extremely effective at allowing them to consolidate power and construct an authoritarian capitalist regime. And not only did the most powerful country in human history help them do it, they helped them to get away with it afterwards. Not only did the most powerful country in U.S. history give them advice and pointers and backing throughout this atrocity, they got to emerge onto the world stage as one of the good guys. And Washington and its full media apparatus sort of, not that it's that simple, but if it could have been perceived as that simple, all, came around to clean up the mess and to pretend that it hadn't happened and to sort of legitimize these regimes as much as possible. So, as I mentioned before, there are over 20 cases in the Cold War where something like this happens. And the title of my book, The Jakarta Method, comes from the fact that in some of these cases, Jakarta was the word that was used to denote this tactic, this plan of action, this method. Most famously, this was in Chile during the presidency of Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist. Jakarta, or Jakarta is coming, was graffitied on the walls of the capital or sent in postcards to leftists or perceived leftists or employees of the regime. And the message to anybody that was paying attention at that point in the Cold War was very clear. The message was, we're going to kill you, just like they killed those communists. And in 1973, with the U.S.-backed coup, which deposed Salvador Allende and led to the regime of Augusto Pinochet, Jakarta did come. That is exactly what happened. They killed thousands of people, often the people that had received these messages previously, and I met some of them. They still remember very vividly this threat, not knowing that it was terrifying, but not really believing that it was real. Behind the scenes in Brazil, we have something called Operação Jakarta, which again was not very public. Just this Operation Jakarta had been discussed, at least in secret, by the Brazilian military. In 1975, Brazil and Chile and many other South American U.S.-backed authoritarian capitalist regimes get together and they create something called the Condor Plan. And Condor is a international mass murder network. It is something that these countries came up with jointly so that they could take care of their perceived enemies anywhere they were in South America or increasingly in the world. I mean, one murder very famously was carried out in Washington, D.C. They planned others in Europe. This was a network of mass murder. Now, in Operation Condor member countries, tens of thousands of people died. And then in the 80s, as Central America became the perceived problem spot for Washington and the anti-communist right globally, Operation Condor leaders traveled up to Central America and gave tips to dictatorships in those countries. Eventually, the U.S. showed up too. And then in Central America, you saw the intentional mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people for being communist or allegedly communist, or really in the case of Guatemala, the worst one in the Western Hemisphere, for being from the wrong indigenous tribe. I mean, entire ethnicities were written off by the dictatorship in Guatemala as being too sympathetic or potentially sympathetic to a left-wing guerrilla movement. And so I think that this tactic, this process, this informal mass murder network that really starts in the early 50s and continues until the end of the 20th century, played a fundamental role in the way that the Cold War happened, in the way that it really concretely shaped life on much of the planet. Again, this is where 2/3 of the Earth's people live. In the West, the Cold War is all spy stuff between Moscow and Washington, maybe a little bit of Berlin, but really the Cold War was about the global South and the vast majority of people that lived through some kind of horrible confrontation, often with the United States being far more aggressive than any socialist power. And as I kind of hint at in the book's subtitle, I really think that this shaped the world that we live in. I think that you would not have this type of globalization, this type of planetary order that we have now, without this tactic being employed in the Cold War.
Absolutely. Yeah, this essentially mass slaughter that's sort of buried, or we learn about it in a very piecemeal way. You make the case that is very much a part of the end of the Cold War and the sort of global hegemony hegemonic capitalism that exists today. So Vincent, I think we're out of time here, but I do want to thank you so much for coming on the program. And I also do want to encourage everyone to pick up the Jakarta Method. I think it's just such an important book, and it's such a broad topic. So it's really, if you want to understand more about why the world is the way it is today, I think it's a great read, and I'd really encourage everyone to read it. So thank you so much, Vincent.
Thank you so much.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, corul, comiti, we yantwe, submiti, we comiti.
Boom, 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 ba ba, boom, 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 ba ba. Calling Keegan in Rockville now. Keegan,
Arun!
I got a hold of you. Excellent.
Hey, hold on one second. I'm fixing something.
Don't
I don't know if this
use
works.
that.
What are you doing?
Oh, sorry. You want to come on the show, George? No.
Hi, George.
Do you want to come on the show?
What?
Well, Arun just called me from his show.
Greetings from Germany.
All right. He's not amused.
That's the right reaction.
What's going on?
So what's going on is that I'm hearing that the machine, your machine, the machine, my machine, the machine, is still pumping things out, and then actually has been doing good work. So even some people who immediately, sided with me because Nomi said so, because whatever, because they're human, for whatever reason, are starting to be like, hey, actually take a look at some of these scripts. So I wanted to see from you if you had any of them so you could show me. And listen, of all the things that I am, I'm certainly not vain. I'm certainly not arrogant or any synonyms with either of those two words. So I'm perfectly willing also to sort of, reopen this case and let us litigate it.
Look, so you may remember where we left it. I said I was going to put a couple other on the website that was that I was tweaking. I was actually going to see if you could tweak them, but I think you were traveling. So I wrote a couple of other ones that I put on there on Arun versus Arun.com. Let me share my screen with you all.
And we talked a bit on our side about making sure when we say these things that there's a robot voice that says them.
Well, that's what I want to do for the voiceover,
we'll see
right?
If we can.
Well,
we'll see if we can.
The one that's winning right now that has been getting the most engagement is this one right here, where the voiceover would be, do you remember when there was a time when we taxed the rich and built roads in the sky? It used to be so easy. If you worked hard, you'd get by, but the pie got taken without much left to eat. There's a stealer at the wheel, and no one seems to know what's right or wrong.
Oh,
we
damn.
hope everyone wakes up before too long. So when I was trying to
Poetry. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I tried to make it
like an
rhyme. I'm not a
erasure
poet, but I took what it spat out and tried to make it.
I can see what people are talking about. That is very good.
So I think I gotta keep working on it, but I'm not sure if the hammer.
So here's what I think. I think you come back on the show next week, maybe 2 weeks, but sometime August during the summer, we have round 2. This time I find a better figure to emulate than John Henry, who I did look it up. People are right. He did actually pass away while beating the machine. That's not my plan exactly. So we'll cinch up all that stuff. We'll have music. We'll have a new graphics segment. We'll have the whole Xhevat, right? It's going to be great.
Why don't we show Arun, if you're willing to do this, what it'll be like if you and the machine work together? Because I think this is where this thing is headed. So we could show you using your robot to help write a script that's the best one, and then we can let people decide if that one is better than the ones on the website right now.
Huh. Hello and welcome back to the committee program. I'm your host, Arun Chaudhary, and we have some very special guests with us today. Friends of the show, longtime watchers will know that we are huge admirers of Senator Mike Gravel, the campaign he ran, and the life that he led. And we are lucky enough to have the two founders of the Gravel Institute
and who I met on his campaign informally advising. I don't want to sound like I did more than I did, which was not much. Henry Williams and David Oakes. Hello.
Hello.
And that was certainly an adventure that I do want to talk about. But let's actually first just dive immediately into the Goudiss Institute mission, because it actually is so similar to what Committee, not the program, but the actual company that I work for does, which is the idea of, in electoral politics, sort of storytelling in a different way to counteract what's happening on the right. You all are concentrating sort of in the online hearts and minds YouTube battlefield, especially for young people's minds, specifically with an enemy in mind, PragerU. Can you just walk us through the mission of the Institute, how you're going about it, how you're thinking about it? The same question everyone always asks you first when they talk to you about the Institute.
Yeah, no question. I mean, as you said, I say we see it as contiguous with groups like Committee, with basically everything going on the left right now. Basically, one thing the right has and has had for decades now is an ecosystem. It has an entire network that goes from policy thinking, think tank, operational stuff, through electoral politics, through judicial politics like the Federalist Society, and through their communications arms. They back PragerU, they back Policy Ed, they back all these front-facing communications arms that translate a lot of their right-wing ideas into right-wing biases. And the goal for them, particularly PragerU, is going after where they're weak, which is young people, the internet, outside of Facebook. What we exist to do is basically be the counterweight to one part of that machine, one part of that system, which is the stuff that speaks authoritatively to those who are, if not apolitical or right or left, people who are young, people who maybe have some set of political beliefs but are influenceable. It's about changing their core assumptions and beliefs. PragerU, their main goal is just getting young people to be Republican, getting them to be right-wing, getting them to have this set of biases and assumptions that will shape how they view the world. And they know they're pushing against the current. I mean, young people in general are further left, but what they also have is tremendous resources. They have $30 million a year. They spend half of it just on YouTube ads and ads across all platforms. If you've ever used YouTube, you've seen them, you've heard them. They are inescapable, really, and that's their power, is the incredible reach that they have. So our goal is to respond to that symmetrically. Eventually we hope for every topic they've ever covered, for every piece of propaganda they've ever put out, we're counter-programming against it, and we have something to respond to it with. And soon enough, we'd like to be as large as them and have the same reach, and we'll see about the same budget. I doubt that that's ever going to happen. But that's kind of the classic asymmetry with right and left. They have the money. In theory, we have the people.
Yeah, which is sort of why I think I always describe these things as needing to be asymmetrical in some nature. David, describe the YouTube battlefield, though, right? Like, people watching this right. show, which is the Committee program on Nomiki Konst's channel, so like progressive on top of progressive, will probably be served a Jordan Peterson video within 2 videos of watching this.
Right.
Is it a level playing field? Is it a bit tilted? How does that work in your experience as somebody who's actually mixing it up now?
Well, I think it's largely a matter of volume, and it's largely a matter of, I think conservatives, for everything bad you can say about them, they are very assiduous in kind of crafting an overall strategy on a lot of these platforms that can be surprisingly appealing to a lot of people who are kind of generally kind of less political, a lot of the time lower information, with nothing wrong with that, of course. I think you see that a lot on Facebook, and we're kind of focused on the YouTube side as well. I mean, the Facebook thing, everybody talks about it all the time. It's a huge issue. But I think it really does reflect how well they've crafted this, and it took them a long time. PragerU, I think, was founded in 2009, and it didn't really have any real success until 2015, 2016. So it's the result of a very long-termist plan of building kind of a real set of institutions that kind of feed into each other, and that kind of create this rabbit hole that people can fall into very easily.
Yeah, and to take David's point seriously about it being a long-term plan, I mean, PragerU is over 10 years old now, but the right-wing project that they represent is, I mean, more than 50 years old. Really, I mean, you can go back to 1971, you know, the Lewis Powell memo, the classic story of future Supreme Court justice at the time, a sort of corporate lawyer to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce after the 60s, after the moment of the New Left, basically saying, corporate America, business elites, the rich, the powerful, we need to get our shit together and build a political machine to prevent radical change. You know, we need to suppress what left-wing activism movements there have been in the last 10 years. We need to constrain what's possible in our politics, and we need to create a project to do things like seizing the Supreme Court, you know, and going back to an era like the Lochner Court in the 20s and 30s, where it was ruthlessly anti-worker, it was ruthlessly anti-left, welfare state to any degree. I think in certain ways, you know, they've succeeded at doing that. You know, the Federalist Society was designed to do exactly that, and now we have that court. You know, you can talk about social issues, but in practice, this is one of the most anti-worker courts we've seen since the 20s. And it's in every single decision they make. And you honestly even see it from the supposedly moderate justices. You even see it from Breyer sometimes, that they make these terrible, terrible rulings. All of that stuff is a project that they started in 1971, you know. Even things like the Manhattan Institute, that PragerU draws a lot of its ideas, talking points, presenters from, that work that they're doing. I mean, right now, PragerU, they're continuing in a long tradition, and one that is wildly very well funded and very organized. And the thing is, unlike the left, they don't have a coordination problem where people they're not on the same page. They don't have these factional disputes to the same extent, because the money flows from one direction, you know, and that money directs everyone. They're all on the same side so long as their checks are being signed by the same people. And that's not a phenomenon that exists on the left at all.
No, I mean, I think we talk about it a lot, and also how the left system, and I would say especially here in Europe, is sort of singularly designed to fight elections and not to have a cultural conversation. And I guess I would ask you both, and I do think I consume a lot of conservative media just because doing what I do and sort of trying to, you know, counter-program populist messaging and make content and stuff. I'm looking at a lot of this content all the time. But you guys are looking at it in huge gobs and batches, as Henry says, to sort of counter-program brick for brick the structure that they're making. What is the recipe, right? Is it more bread and butter issues than we think about, and sort of the ones that we see from the progressive left and consuming kind of center left and left media? Is it different than the culture wars we perceive as happening? Or what is the conversation that's happening? Because they're having that conversation in a vacuum, right? They are the ones who are reaching out to maybe marginalized communities who do not have a propensity to vote, or maybe low propensity voters who are not on the Democratic rolls, who fall outside this technological machine that Democrats have created to contest elections. I've spoken too much, please.
Right. Yeah, I think to the point that you make, which is what is the answer? There isn't a single one. You know, the thing that is so effective about the right-wing side is not necessarily just the organized stuff like PragerU, but the ecosystem that lies just underneath it. You know, they promote the top of the funnel very heavily, and it's easy from there to fall into all kinds of creators, Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, these people who have their own little sort of like online fiefdoms, that sort of thing. You know, countering that, one of the asymmetries is that there isn't that sort of united ecosystem, and there isn't as much of an entry point or a gateway. That's our biggest focus, is that both first exposure and then also how do you draw people in deeper? You know, what are some fundamental facts that contradict the narrative of history that they've been taught, that contradict the political assumptions inherent in a certain Democratic Party, mainstream liberal mindset? You know, I mean, I think David and I are certainly plenty conspiratorial ourselves in certain ways, and a lot of it comes down to things like the 1971 Bangladeshi genocide, or, you know, the 60s Indonesian genocide, or any of these things that are these big gaps never taught in American history, never taught in the context of the Cold War or in America's role in them. These sort of things, they fundamentally change your understanding of and relationship to power. You know, once you understand them, they make people distrustful. The weird thing is that a lot of people learn about some element of this stuff and then they go to the right, or they become a kind of blanket conspiracist. I think the goal is to, you know, bring those facts to people for the first time, and then also hopefully direct them in a direction that actually is politically useful, that they can understand what kind of answer is there to this. Is there one? What am I supposed to do with this information, basically? And then the last thing I would say is just that you have to be comprehensive, omni-channel, like where people are exposed to political stuff now, or what is even political, is so much different than it was even 10 years ago. Politics is in everything. It's saturated into pop culture and TikTok, what have you. I think one thing that is very weak in PragerU is that when you AstroTurf, you can only really do stuff from the official mouth, right? And people have this difficulty in getting talking points to stick organically because you basically have to pay people to say them. I think our goal and our hope is to build more of a kind of cultural or soft power, such that people reference these as left-wing talking points, but also that they end up saturating into just the way people talk to each other. And
culture
talk
people
on
would
TikTok
like to consume.
And I think you see on Twitter actually a phenomenon of this. Not to say Twitter is particularly useful or anything like that. I don't necessarily believe that. But you do see what happens when you create almost like a subculture that is very left, and that there's a whole set of jokes or ideas that are genuinely quite left-leaning. I think it has actually pushed people who use it, at least, who are in that world, to the left. You kind of need to create that across the entire culture and for everyone. You need a leftism for gamers and for whoever else. Our hope as well is to work with people who are popular in a certain subculture or whatever, that have a following. Hassan Piker is an example, somebody who has a large following of people who are just don't necessarily have a definable politics or even aren't political at all. How can you reach them and reach them on topics they care about and serve as their introduction? You need a lot of ways in. That's one thing conservatives understand well. It doesn't matter why you're in the coalition. The thing is that there's some grievance that you have. See, critical race theory or cancel culture or whatever it is, just has to have enough of a grievance that you feel like you're in. The left needs more of those points of entries, and it can't just be you need to understand the whole package. You need to understand Marxism or whatever. I mean, if you're asking that, you've already lost. You have to ask people to understand almost nothing and still be on your side.
When you're explaining, you're losing is the constant mantra. So, just in the same way, and I'm going to just dovetail all this together beautifully, you're all going to be super impressed. But in the same way, for a lot of us, Mike Gravel in 2008, so older Gravel, was kind of a gateway drug into understanding modern anti-imperialist, anti-colonial project. His campaign, as led by you two, was kind of a gateway drug for a lot of Gen X folks into politics, even in this sort of disruptive way that you're even talking about now. Can you just tell us a little bit about the origin story of how you all found the campaign? And then I do want to hear about what he thought about the Institute as you all were getting ready to set it up, because I'm sure he had extremely pointed things to say.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll just give the basic context, which is that David reached out to Mike. He was deep into his retirement, and he happened to have a public website, and we reached out saying, listen, we loved you in 2008. We were both literally 8 years old, so I don't think we saw it on TV.
I was about to call you out on that. To be like...
But we had seen it. We'd seen it online and had heard of him, referenced actually in the context of the Iraq War. Who in American life, I mean, not even just opposed the Iraq War, spoke of it in terms that were actually morally equivalent and appropriate to what a atrocity and crime it was. And you have a list of maybe 4 items: Barbara Lee, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Mike Gravel, maybe others I'm forgetting now. I mean, certainly Tony Benn, not people who were big political figures today, many of whom are even gone today. There's just so few people that spoke with it in that sense, in those terms that are really strident and moralistic. Mike was one of those, and so that's why we reached out to him. We basically said 2020 needs something like this. It needs something that is setting that moral tone, because with 2008, as you said, Arun, it exposed people then who maybe were gadflies and are leftists now, and it's translated some of it into now. But the real expression of Mike at the time was that it was seen as so out there, so on the fringes, so far from anything that could be a political reality. It's crazy how far it's come and how much has changed since then. Mike was the first candidate to ever march, first presidential candidate to ever march in a gay pride parade ever, and certainly the only candidate of the era other than Dennis Kucinich who supported gay marriage. Those things are just totally, unquestionable now in the Democratic Party. They absolutely were not to Obama when he was running either time. They were not to Clinton, to Biden. that's what Gravel did. That's what he represents and represented, and that's what we were trying to do in 2020 as well. Basically, was stake out a position, particularly on foreign policy and also on maybe even a sense of outrage. Like, how mad should you really be at the DNC, at the system that we are forced to live with? What's the tone that you should take, maybe? That was a big part of it for us. But I'll be honest, I mean, we had no idea where it was going to go or that it would be as successful as it was in terms of people noticing and caring at all. He was definitely a gadfly in 2008. He was the gadfly in 2020 as well. The difference was it was all young people. The second time around, a lot of them, including us, weren't even alive or were too young to have known him when he ran last time.
You all got critical mass of donors get him in the debates. What was the percentage of that was the young people you're talking about? Because that's always a good way to get a snapshot.
It was so young. I'd have to look at it again, but I mean, right now.
But roughly, it was overwhelmingly.
Our following is currently 75% under 35. So that's the general sense of it.
That's not me, by the way.
And political donors usually lean old, so I assume we're on the opposite side of that spectrum. We also had a smaller average donation as well from people because we were asking only for $1. I mean, again, it was, and that's, I mean, the one regret. Obviously, we would have loved to have seen Mike up on stage, throwing Molotov cocktails like he did last time. Although I will say, it mattered a lot in 2008 because TV and national TV still had such a pull and such a draw, and obviously some of the Democratic debates were well watched. But in practice, it was much more the campaign's place in the media ecosystem that mattered rather than him on stage or not. And what I'd say to a lot of people is, when Mike passed recently, and I mean, it was so hard for us in the time leading up to it just because we knew how much there is ahead still, how much there is for the Institute ahead, and how much he's not going to be able to see as a result, which is, that's by far our biggest disappointment, the biggest sadness of his death. But the real inspiring thing was just how many people were eulogizing him and from this insane political range. The Republican senators from Alaska, the Libertarian Party of Texas, actual Maoist, Marxist-Leninist types. You have this colossal range of figures eulogizing him, and a lot of young people, I mean, to be honest, including us, who didn't know who he was 3, 4, 5 years ago, or what he represents, what he did in 2008, what he did during the Vietnam War, what he symbolizes. And him as a symbol, I think, is what he's powerful.
We showed one of his old campaign ads that's like a 25-minute ad of him sort of going around Alaska.
Man for Alaska. That's an incredible one.
Beautiful piece, really well shot. But what's funny is also remembering, because I think we think of him as a sort of shocking, The Rock and then the debate performance, but he was actually like a real talented politician who had what we used to call chops. Like, he had a lot of chops. He could he could have conversations with people. This was not just sort of a ranting ideologue, this, that, the other thing we can forget, that this is a guy who ran in a big state, covered a lot of ground, a lot of different kinds of people, and had real conversations.
Yeah, no question. I mean, a lot of these figures that people sometimes bring up as gadflies or whatever, as fire, as bomb throwers, fire breathers, whatever, Ron Paul or, Dennis Kucinich or even people like Ralph Nader, even people like Ross Perot, these gadfly figures or whomever who've kind of jumped into our politics at points. In general, they really lack political savvy. In general, they really lack those basic political retail skills because there's in a certain way because they're
Bernie's got them also.
Yes,
that's a similarity between the two of them.
Because they're not like good politicians, that makes them good figures, and that's even what draws people to them. One interesting thing about Mike is that he was actually a tremendously good politician as well, and not just in ways that were time appropriate, period appropriate or of that era, but really like he was a more modern politician than a lot of other people in that era. I mean, Man for Alaska, which was this basically 30-minute infomercial he made to pitch himself to the people of Alaska. I mean, Mike was born in Massachusetts. He was actually French-Canadian, born in Massachusetts, or grew up in Massachusetts, went to school in New York. He went to Alaska knowing that it was going to be incorporated as a state soon, and it was the only state where he might have a political shot. He said in Massachusetts there were too many Kennedys. They were just lousy with Kennedys, exactly. And so he had to leave there. New York, obviously, was far too much of a machine. So he went to a place that literally wasn't even a state yet, and then he became not only the youngest figure in the Alaska House, then the Speaker of the Alaska House within 8 years. I mean, when he arrived in Alaska, he was a brakeman on the railway, and within 9 years, he was a senator from Alaska, the second ever senator from Alaska. You know, his arc was really insane, and there's very few people like that who are political wunderkind like that, who then are willing to torch it all for what they believe in and for their morality and for what they care about. I mean, here's a perfect parallel. Joe Biden and Mike Gravel were both elected almost the same time, nearly, I think within one election of each other. Both were super young. I mean, they were close to the youngest people in the Senate when they were elected. And both were seen very much as these rising stars, as these big new figures, whatever, and they had a lot of attention, and certainly Mike was good at headline grabbing, and it happened a lot in his career while he was in the Senate. Joe Biden, he kept that career in a bulletproof glass box. He worked with the most detestable figures. He glad-handed with everyone. I mean, one thing Mike said about Joe, because he knew Joe Biden personally, was that he was nice to and friends with everyone, and that was his biggest problem, was that he was friends with the worst people in America, and really the worst people on earth, the most despicable, disgusting, evil people in our society and world. Joe was great friends with them and was friends with everyone. That shows, I think, the inherent poverty of his moral and political character, but also why he survived so damn long and why he's president today. Rarely do you get somebody who has a political career like that, who's this big rising star, who also is not going to do everything they have to keep it forever, to hold on to it for however long Joe did, 50 years in the Senate. I mean, Mike actually knew that after 2 terms, he knew that it was changing him and distorting him in ways that he hated. And he did not even campaign for his last campaign when he lost, because he was so depressed about it, and honestly because he thought if he returned to the Senate, he would be inevitably corrupted by it.
Yeah. David, can you walk us through a bit of the formation of the Institute and what he told you all about, what he was hoping? And, it's just what you're doing is attracting a very young audience on young platforms. And, again, we have the 90-year-old Mike Gravel, who seems to have his finger on this pulse. I want to hear about it.
Right. I mean, that's the thing with Mike, as Henry was saying, was that even though he was, when we knew him, he was already quite old. He always had a remarkable degree of interest in and tolerance for things that young people were doing or were interested in, which is quite rare for people of that age. I think a great example actually would be in 2008 when he led a group of film students do a video of him, like kind of several fairly avant-garde videos with him. The most famous of which was him throwing a rock into a lake.
Rock, it's still the best, still the champ.
Still, it's still a great ad. He did a lot of very, very interesting ads in 2008. I kind of want to meet some of the people who did them. But and then another great example would be in 2019 when we convinced him basically let us use his Twitter account, which is kind of a very rare thing for somebody to.
Very personal, yeah.
After the campaign, we decided that the thing that we would be most interested in doing, especially because Mike had told us, you can start the presidential campaign as long as you promise that you'll stay committed to my cause, basically. Is kind of starting this thing to kind of advance Mike's ideas, and sort of can carry on his legacy, because especially toward the end, I mean, even on the first calls we had with him, I think actually the first thing he ever said to me was, do you know how old I am? Just because
he said there's no way I can be president, and we're like, don't worry, that's not the plan.
But that's why we decided to start the Institute. And Mike was always very, very supportive. I mean, just the best possible person you could ask for. Yeah.
It was more fulfilling a promise in a way than it was a new evolution into something.
Right.
That's interesting.
And Mike said, I mean, there's a couple of things. Mike said actually he also joked if Bernie won, the only job he would do, he would be Secretary of Peace. If Bernie won, he would be a new cabinet position called Secretary of Peace. And that's, one thing about Mike was he had a very much an elder statesman and maybe even like a truly Republican, small r Republican mindset about it, which was the idea of, contributing something to the country while you can. He was focused heavily on things like nuclear disarmament because he really felt the kind of long shadow, not only of the Cold War and all that it created, but also maybe the sense of real responsibility to future generations, to young people. He really felt that he owed something to end the wars in his lifetime, to try to wind down, nuclear war as a possibility. These were his abiding interests, and I think they show you so much about his character and his politics, that he cared the most about all this stuff. And even then when he was passing and when he was near death, he knew this is all projects that were going to way outlive him, that were going to go way further than that. And when we talked about the Institute, that was always what it was about. It was how can we translate the audience that we built and the interest in these politics into a project that can last, that can serve the left, that can serve the causes that he cared about and agitate for them in the long term. And maybe that can keep the attention on the history of the left in America, because it's not like it all began in 2016 with Bernie Sanders. That was the first day there was an American left. Mike knows that in certain ways better than anyone, and I think Bernie and Mike both represent to a lot of people this continuity. There are many incredible leftists from the 60s, 70s, all sorts of figures. The great tragedy is that many of them are dead. Many of them were killed or assassinated or died of AIDS or other sort of intentionally afflicted pandemics of various kinds. Poverty and sort of inner city decay. Yeah. So many of the early left and of the 60s and 70s left's greatest figures and organizers were killed, and in many ways because Mike and Bernie were so privileged, and also because they had power, they survived. They made it. I mean, they outlived basically all their enemies, except Henry Kissinger. The one exception of Henry Kissinger. And they outlived all their enemies, and so they were still here in 2008 when the banks were bailed out, in 2011 when Occupy Wall Street happened, in 2015 when Bernie ran. And through today, they represent to us and to young people who are getting into the left now that there is at least some continuity with that past, that not literally everyone from that era is dead, and that maybe you can be a politician and make it to power and still be less, more than just one of these people, that you can be something different. Again, what Mike did was he destroyed any chance he had a real Senate career. He destroyed the chance that he had of playing ball, of being inside the machine. As a rising star, as a young rising star, he did it because he was morally consumed by what he saw as the crime of the Vietnam War. And, people talk about the Pentagon Papers. That's the flashiest, the most central event. Mike literally introduced hundreds of delaying resolutions to end the draft. He would add an amendment to end the draft into nearly every bill that came up. He would vote down defense authorizations. I mean, Mike was fighting a legislative trench warfare against the Vietnam War his entire time in Congress, above and beyond the Pentagon Papers, and even directly contributed to the end of the draft in America. These are some of the things that we would point to, because he did get this power, and today there are progressives, there are leftists who are seeking that power today. And I think the point of advice and the thing to remember is it's possible to be like Mike. And when you do something like that, your memory is so much strong. I mean, nobody else remembers any of the other senators, even the ones who are considered progressive from that era. I mean, does anyone talk about the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act, right? No, it's completely lost to history. But what Mike did stands on, and I hope that this sort of next generation of people, even in Congress, will remember that and think about it that way, especially because of how much things have changed since then and how much more is possible.
That is really, really nicely put. Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you so much, David. And we'll check in soon. And people, you should continue, because I'm sure most of you already do, supporting the Gravel Institute and all of their videos.
I'll just plug,
subscribe.
For anyone watching, I'll just
And
plug patreon.com/Gravel Institute. And stay tuned from us. We got some very exciting things coming in the next few weeks. And we're just now expanding our production capacity and getting a full-time studio. So very excited, and excited to have Arun in there, hopefully sometime soon when he's back in New York.
Yeah. We will do something, 100%. That is guaranteed.
Excellent.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for watching today's show. You know, I've really, really come to love the studio here, even though it's still in its nascent stages and the curtain needs to be steamed something fierce. So I was going to do tonight's Sleepy Time reading from the studio. And actually, going to read chapter 4 of the book that we've been digging into so deeply, which is Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti. And we talked a lot already about how crowds are formed and how the most distinctive property of a crowd, whether it's open or closed. Remember, open can take in everything from like a neighborhood, closed, something more like a theater performance where it's a creation. But what we haven't, and we've talked about how the lack of distinction in which people feel in a crowd is sort of the crucial element of it. But we haven't talked about what I think people in our modern discourse think about when they think about crowds so often, which is destructiveness, which is the idea of kind of the potential for riot, for wanton destruction, for just sort of nameless, faceless, this thing that we fear about the crowd. Canetti writes about it in a different way. Anyway, why don't I just read it? Why am I telling you about it? Destructiveness. The destructiveness of the crowd is often mentioned as its most conspicuous quality, and there is no denying the fact that it can be observed everywhere in the most diverse countries and civilizations. It is discussed and disapproved of, but never really explained. The crowd particularly likes destroying houses and objects. Breakable objects like window panes, mirrors, pictures, and crockery. And people tend to think that it is the fragility of these objects which stimulates the destruction of the crowd. It is true that the noise of the destruction adds to its satisfaction. The banging of windows and the crashing of glass are the robust sounds of fresh life, the cries of something newborn. It is easy to evoke them, and that increases their popularity. Everything shouts together, the din of the applause of objects. There seems to be a special need for this kind of noise at the beginning of the events, when the crowd is still small and little or nothing has happened. The noise is a promise of the reinforcements the crowd hopes for, and a happy omen for deeds to come. But it will be wrong to suppose that the case for which things can be broken is a decisive factor in these situations. Sculptures of solid stone have been mutilated beyond recognition. Christians have destroyed the heads and the arms of Greek gods, and reformers and revolutionaries have hauled down the statues of saints, sometimes from dangerous heights, though often the stone they wanted to destroy has been so hard that they achieved only half of their purpose. The destruction of representational images is the destruction of a hierarchy which is no longer recognized, is the violation of generally established and universally visible and valid distances. The solidity of the images was the expression of their permanence. They seem to have existed forever, upright and immovable. Never before had it been possible to break them with hostile intent. Now they are hauled down and broken to pieces. It is this act the discharge accomplishes itself. But it does not always go as far as this. The more usual kind of destruction mentioned above is simply an attack on boundaries. Windows and doors belong to houses. They are the most vulnerable part of their exterior, and once they are smashed, the house has lost its individuality. Anyone may enter it, and nothing and no one is protected anymore. In these houses live the supposed enemies of the crowd, those people who try to keep away from it. What separates them has now been destroyed, and nothing stands between them and the crowd. They can come out and join it, or they can be fetched. But there is more to it than this. In the crowd, the individual feels that he is transcending the limits of his own person. He has a sense of relief, for the distances are removed, which used to throw him back on himself and shut him in. With the lifting of these burdens of distance, he feels free. His freedom is the crossing of these boundaries. He wants what is happening to him to happen to others too. He expects it to happen to them. An earthen pot irritates him for all the boundaries. The closed door of a house irritate him. Rites and ceremonies, anything which preserves distance, threaten him and seem unbearable. He fears that sooner or later,